SEP FanFic Readings presents Thanks to the Photographs by Unstable Hufflepuff. Chapter 1. Return to Society. The office of the headmistress of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry looked nearly the same as it had the last time Hermione Granger had been there, over 6 years ago. It was quite heartwarming, she had to admit, that both Minerva McGonagall and Severus Snape had decided against altering much of Albus Dumbledore's old office. The few changes were small, such as the jar that once held lemon sherbets and was now filled with biscuits, the large tartan rug on the floor, and an entire row of one of the bookshelves that was dedicated to copies of Transfiguration Today. It felt a little surreal sitting opposite the headmistress at nearly 25 years old. Her hands clasped together in her lap to keep from fidgeting. She had been certain of this choice, and still was, but the reality of following through with it was a little frightening. Hermione had not been back in the UK in over 2 years. She had been studying towards a mastery in Transfiguration in Venice when she ran into her old professor at a celebratory dinner party. She supposed she shouldn't have been so surprised to see her there, given that Minerva had introduced her to the wizard she was studying under, but the moment she saw her again, Hermione had frozen in shock. Minerva McGonagall had appeared equally surprised. 2 years prior, she had assisted Hermione in what one might call fleeing the country. After practically her entire life blew up in her face, Hermione had been desperate to leave, to abandon ship, and Minerva had helped her by putting her in touch with the Transfiguration master living in Italy that had once been a student of hers at Hogwarts. His name was Malcolm Adler, and he'd graduated 5 years ahead of Hermione, giving him just enough time to bolt when the war started. No, it wasn't Hermione's presence there that had surprised Minerva. It was the fact that she'd arrived in time to see Malcolm with his hands up her skirt outside the restaurant. Once upon a time, Hermione would have thought that had been one of the most embarrassing moments in her life. Now it didn't even rank. The dinner party had been thrown by Malcolm in honor of Hermione completing her Transfiguration mastery, and was attended by all those they worked with at his lab. After dessert, while everyone was happily chatting amongst themselves over drinks, Minerva had taken Hermione by the arm and whisked her out the door. "You've come a long way from the young girl I met all those years ago," Minerva had said as they strolled along the narrow streets at dusk, her wizened face solemn. "I hope you know how truly proud I am of you and your many accomplishments. You've grown into a brilliant young witch. That much is clear to anyone who has the pleasure of making your acquaintance. But Hermione, it is time to come home." She'd then offered her a job teaching Transfiguration at Hogwarts, and seeing as Hermione had no interest whatsoever in returning to the Ministry of Magic, she'd accepted. Now she sat in the headmistress's office in mid-August, downright terrified of seeing any of her past acquaintances again. The only people she'd bothered to stay in touch with during her 2 years abroad, well, more accurately, the only people willing to speak with her, were Harry and Ginny Potter, George Weasley, Neville Longbottom, and, shockingly, Luna Lovegood. The only other posts she ever received were generous amounts of howlers and an unsettling number of death threats. "Classes will start, as always, on September 1st, Minerva said promptly, drawing Hermione from her thoughts. "You will have these next 2 weeks to settle into the castle and come up with a curriculum for the year. Of course, there is a curriculum already in place," she added, with a hint of a smirk, "but I am quite sure you've already made plans to refurbish it." Hermione smiled sheepishly. "Only because there's so many advances in recent years that need to be included," she said. "Not because you were ever anything other than a thorough teacher." Minerva smiled, but her face slowly fell as she began to frown. Those narrowed eyes behind her square-rimmed spectacles and those pursed lips created an expression Hermione had not seen in a very long time, and she felt much like a child again. "What is it?" she asked apprehensively. After a moment's hesitation, Minerva sighed and removed her spectacles. She folded her arms over her desk and fixed Hermione with a determined yet sympathetic look. "I'm afraid you are not the only new hire this year," she said. "I was hesitant to tell you, seeing as this new hire is not someone you share a particularly pleasant history with. I was unsure or not as to whether you would agree to take the job if you knew." Hermione's immediate thought was Draco Malfoy, but that was ridiculous. Well, she thought so anyway, until Minerva went on to explain that he would be teaching charms starting that year. The portrait of Severus Snape had to remind Hermione to shut her mouth, else she would catch flies. But why?" she finally said. Phileas announced his retirement this past April," Minerva explained, somewhat grimly. "He and I were going to search together privately for an appropriate replacement for him, but it would seem the Malfoy family still has eyes everywhere, and they caught wind of our plans. Mr. Malfoy approached us that very week to apply for the position." "Miss Granger, are you capable of shutting your mouth, or do you plan on continuing to act like a codfish?" asked Snape's portrait. Hermione hastily shut her mouth again. Now, Severus," said Dumbledore's portrait calmly. "She has every right to be a little surprised. You were too, if I recall correctly." Snape sneered at him, but fell silent. Did Malfoy say why he was interested in the position?" Hermione asked, finally finding her voice. Minerva straightened up slightly. "He did not, and I decided against asking him," she said severely. "He was, in fact, an exceptional charm student, and completed a mastery after graduating. He is more than qualified to teach the subject, and I think it would do us no good to question his motives." Hermione frowned, but said nothing. She couldn't see why Malfoy would have any interest in returning to Hogwarts, let alone to teach. That said, she didn't want anyone questioning her motives either, since she was, essentially, continuing to hide from both Muggle and Wizarding society. "He will be arriving later this afternoon, and I plan on introducing you both to the rest of the staff at dinner this evening." She nodded slowly, still rather bewildered. "Now, seeing as we're finished up here," Minerva went on, smiling once more, "there is someone outside waiting for you to show you to your living quarters that is very anxious to see you." Now it was Hermione's turn to smile. She stood up to hug the headmistress, and thanked her for this opportunity for the 10th time before racing out the door, down the spiral steps, and practically leaping into the arms of Neville Longbottom. He swung her around, grinning from ear to ear, his face slightly pink, and gave her a final squeeze before setting her back down to look at her. "Merlin, Hermione, don't ever run away like that again," he said breathlessly, and she couldn't help but giggle. "I hope you know how much I've missed you. How much we all have. It's good to finally have you back." "It's good to be back," said Hermione, though she wasn't quite sure if she was telling the truth. "I have to admit, knowing that you were teaching herbology here definitely helped me in making my decision." Neville laughed, his eyes bright with glee, and Hermione took a moment to survey him. He looked pretty much the same as the last time she'd seen him, but there was a certain confidence that hadn't been there before. He had grown into a strong and handsome man following the war. But she wondered if this new self-assurance was the doing of his new girlfriend, Hannah Abbott, who he'd written to her about on countless occasions. He took her by the arm and led her through the numerous corridors and stairwells she'd spent her childhood sneaking about with Harry and Ron, taking her to the 4th floor, where her living quarters were. It was a small apartment hidden behind a tapestry and a password-guarded portrait. There was a single and plain bedroom, a bathroom, and a small living area completed with a quaint wooden breakfast table. The windows on the far side of the room looked out upon the Black Lake and the edge of the Forbidden Forest. Her trunks had already been brought up by house elves, but she tried to ignore that fact. "So, now that you're back," Neville began tentatively, sitting at the table while he watched Hermione unpack. "Am I allowed to update you?" "What do you mean?" she asked absently, her attention focused mainly on placing her books on their shelf in alphabetical order. Then it hit her. "Oh." She turned to face Neville, feeling her face heat. "I suppose I'm going to have to hear about him eventually, aren't I? It would probably be best to hear it from you, an outside perspective." Neville smiled grimly, then glanced down at his lap, his brow furrowed. It took him a moment to speak. He seemed to be choosing his words carefully. "Well, he and Lavender decided to get married, for starters. They'll be celebrating their 2-year anniversary next month. They're expecting another kid soon." Hermione inhaled sharply and forced herself to continue putting away her books, though her hands were shaking. "They have a home near the Burrow, and from what Harry and Ginny tell me, they spend quite a lot of time there." Neville continued carefully. "Ron quit his job in the Auror office pretty soon after you left, and he co-owns Weasley's Wizard Wheezes with George now. He likes it much better than being out in the field or filling out paperwork. He's, quite a bit happier there." She nodded her head to show that she was listening, but he was still staring at his lap and did not notice her. "The Daily Prophet doesn't really bring up what happened so much anymore, not unless there's a piece on their relationship. The engagement announcement brought everything back up, but since then it's mainly been small mentions here and there. I can't say the same for Witch Weekly, though." Hermione blinked and stopped, turning her head to stare at Neville. She had never heard his voice take on such a dangerous tone. "Parvati Patil is now assistant to the editor, and she and Lavender have always been close," he said, and he gave a humorless laugh that was extremely unsettling coming from someone normally so kind. "She likes to bring up what happened in nearly every issue, even included photographs on the 1-year anniversary. Don't worry, though," he added quickly, glancing up at her. "They're still not allowed to print the whole picture, so you were covered up." That fact didn't make her feel much better. She had never been more glad that her parents were still living in Australia and had no idea who she was. The images they must have seen in papers, magazines, and gossip sites alike of some unclothed girl pressed up against a window being taken from behind by the American ambassador's son would have been far more disgusting to them if they'd known it was their own daughter. Ginny had taken her out that night, to a club in Muggle London, in the hopes of taking her mind off of Ron. They thought they'd be safe from reporters there. But when Hermione got drunk and went home with a good-looking man that turned out to be an ambassador's son, she hadn't realized she needed to worry about Muggle paparazzi as well. Partially blacked-out pictures of her had been on the front page of Muggle papers the next day, followed by magazines, and the news rapidly made its way around the wizarding world. She thanked the gods she didn't believe in every day that wizards had yet to discover the internet. Otherwise, they too would have seen the unedited version of those pictures, not to mention the video. She had been painted as a party girl and a harlot, and seeing the photos herself, she couldn't blame anyone for believing it. She was followed and photographed by Muggle and wizarding reporters for weeks before eventually quitting her ministry job and fleeing the country with the help of her old mentor. Any hopes she had of becoming Minister for Magic one day were dashed, and the respect she'd garnered from her role in Voldemort's defeat diminished. "Do people—" She paused, taking a steadying breath. "Do people still talk about it? I mean, are people going to have a problem with me, teaching their children?" Neville frowned and shifted a little in his seat. She hadn't seen him looking so uncomfortable since Snape taught them potions. "Do you remember in our 5th year when Harry was brought up in the Prophet from time to time?" he asked hesitantly. "How they'd mention him to, make a joke? It's sort of like that." Hermione sniffed and nodded. "Fantastic." Neville was watching her, looking like he wanted to comfort her, but she couldn't handle any more of this embarrassment right now. This was exactly what she had left to avoid. Her eyes were already burning, and she knew she'd be in tears soon. "Thank you for telling me," she said, hating that her voice broke. "I'll just see you at dinner, if that's all right." He nodded in understanding, gave her another hug, and left her to finish unpacking. He had barely been gone a minute before she was sobbing on the floor. It had been a long time since she was forced to deal with this, and to be honest, she wasn't sure if she ever really had dealt with it. She doubted running away could be classified as healthy coping mechanism, or a coping mechanism at all. It had all started with one of her and Ron's fights, which were nearly always about the same thing. He wanted to start the next chapter of his life. She didn't want to stay home and become the next Mrs. Weasley at 22. She'd said she was done, and he thought she was talking about their relationship. She had meant the conversation. He'd gone out and didn't return until the next morning. 1 month later, Lavender Brown showed up pregnant on their doorstep. Everything deteriorated fairly quickly from there. It was nearly nightfall by the time Hermione had calmed down. She went to the bathroom to freshen up, change her clothes, and head down to the Great Hall to face the world she'd left behind for the first time in 2 years. To say she was nervous would be an understatement. Neville, being the good friend he was waiting for her at the doors when she arrived. She took his arm and allowed him to lead her inside. With the students home for the summer, the usual house tables had been replaced with one large table in the middle of the room. It looked as though the rest of the Hogwarts staff was already there waiting. There were only 2 seats left, and she could tell straight away why they were the ones left empty. His hair was just as blonde as she remembered it, his features just as sharp, and his cool exterior perfectly intact. Draco Malfoy sat at his seat, inspecting the cutlery laid out before him, likely to avoid meeting any of the suspicious looks he was receiving from those surrounding him. Though, lucky for him, the second Hermione approached the table, all of the unwanted attention was on her. "Are you all settled in, then?" Minerva asked. as Hermione and Neville took their seats on either side of Malfoy, clearly attempting to diffuse the tension. "Yes, thank you," she said, and a second later, their food had appeared on the gold platters before them. Everyone helped themselves, and she copied Malfoy by keeping her head down. This tactic wasn't so successful, however, seeing as she, unlike him, was not feared. "I did see it coming," Professor Trelawney said suddenly, sounding troubled. "But I thought I had seen wrong. It was the first time I'd ever doubted my predictions. I didn't think there was any way it could have been you that I had seen." Hermione's face went bright red. She was sure of it. She looked up to find the entire table staring at her, even Malfoy. For some reason, his cool gaze felt the most unnerving. Minerva sighed irritably. "It's good to know your sight is still intact," said Hermione coldly. Malfoy snorted. The entire table fell silent. Minerva was shooting a deathly glare in Trelawney's direction, though the self-proclaimed seer did not seem to notice. Then a young woman on Hermione's right piped up. "Well, this is fucking awkward." Minerva dropped her fork. It fell to her plate with a clatter. She leaned forward to place her face in her hands, shaking her head in exasperation. "For the last time, Veronica," she said, "the use of that language is not permitted while working in a children's institution." The woman named Veronica smiled guiltily and tucked a strand of her sunshine-colored hair behind her ear. She had a strange, childlike innocence in her features, though she couldn't be much younger than Hermione. "Sorry, Minnie," she mumbled, and then she turned to face Hermione so quickly that it startled her. She stuck out her hand. "Veronica Smith, it's nice to meet you. I've heard a lot about you." She winced. "Shit, that's not what I meant." "Veronica!" warned Minerva. Veronica gave Hermione a sheepish look, though she did not lower her hand. Slowly, Hermione reached out and took it. "I was 3 years below you at Hogwarts, but you probably knew my brother, Zacharias," said Veronica. "I teach potions." Before Hermione could respond, Veronica leaned over to extend her hand again to Malfoy. He eyed it warily. "Oh, get over yourself. I'm merely being polite," she snapped, and he gently shook her hand, frowning. "There you go. That wasn't so hard, was it?" Malfoy raised his eyebrows at her. Hermione could tell they were both thinking the same thing, that Veronica was a horrifying amount like her older brother. It was unclear whether or not Veronica caught on to their apprehensiveness, because she then asked Neville to pass her the mashed potatoes and proceeded to stuff her face with them. Seeing such a petite person eat so much reminded Hermione of Ginny, and she found herself smiling. That is, until Malfoy finally spoke up. "So, Granger, what brings you back from wherever it is you ran off to?" She paused, a spoonful of potatoes halfway to her mouth. She slowly lowered her spoon and looked at him, expecting to see the same smug, superior look he'd always given her. Instead, he merely looked amused. Somehow that was worse. "I finished my mastery," she said, shrugged in an attempt to appear unaffected. "It was time to come back." He nodded, smirking. She raised an eyebrow at him. "And what, pray tell, brings you here?" she asked coolly. "Last I heard, you were engaged to be married. You know, getting ready to start popping out more heirs to continue on with the Malfoy name." For some reason, this made Malfoy look even more amused. That had not been the effect she was going for. "That was quite a while ago," he said calmly. "As for why I'm here, I guess you could say a change in scenery." She hummed in response and returned to her meal, because she truly had no idea what to say to that. Neville was looking particularly nervous. Veronica, unfortunately, was perfectly at ease amidst the tension. "He came here for the same reason you did," she said, chortling. "Fucked up his life and decided to hide out here at Hogwarts." That wiped the smirk right off Malfoy's face. Hermione didn't know whether to be embarrassed or burst out laughing, since she had indirectly been insulted right along with him. "Regardless," Veronica went on cheerfully, "I am very glad of your presence. Neville and I get bored sometimes without the kids here, so it's nice to have company. Younger company, I mean," she added, grimacing as she looked up to the other professors. "Sorry, guys." Hermione took a moment to wonder why the Smith family continued having children after Zacharias. "It may surprise you two to hear this," Minerva said tiredly, looking at her and Malfoy, "but Veronica is actually very good with her students." Hermione somehow doubted that. "You said you teach potions," Malfoy asked, leaning slightly towards Hermione in order to see Veronica. She would be lying if she said the closeness didn't make her uncomfortable. Yes, said Veronica happily. I took over last year when Professor Slughorn retired for what he's declared to be the last time. I really do enjoy it. I have a slightly different method of teaching that may or may not have caught some of the older students off guard, but I am proud to say I'm no Snape. May he rest in peace. She really does teach a whole lot differently than either of them, Neville said, looking thoughtful. The old dungeon classroom is hardly recognizable anymore. Luna painted it, if you can believe it. Hermione looked at Veronica, taken aback. You're friends with Luna? She asked. Oh, yes, said Veronica, nodding. Neville introduced me to her before I started teaching here. I have to be honest with you, though. I haven't a fucking clue what half the creatures are she painted, but the overall effect is nice. It's really livened up the place. Hermione chuckled slightly. I can imagine. You're friends with Luna too, aren't you, Hermione? Hermione, that's quite a mouthful. I'm going to call you Hermione, okay? Anyway, she told me plenty about you. All good things, of course. Though I did have the displeasure of meeting that ex of yours. And I can't say the name there. His kid was cute, I'll give him that. But my God, he was an arse when it came to talking about you. Poor little Rosie, stuck with a father like that. It's a shame, really. Oh, Merlin, and don't even get me started on the mother. What did you say? Veronica looked up at her expectantly. Which part? His daughter, said Hermione quietly. What did you say her name was? Oh, Rose. Rose Weasley. Cute name, huh? Suits her really well, too. She really is adorable. What, Neville? Why are you looking at me like that? Hermione turned to look at Neville, only to have him lean back in his seat, hiding behind Malfoy. She leaned over Malfoy to see his face, no longer caring how close she was getting. Her entire body was trembling with rage. You didn't tell me her name was Rose, she said in a low voice. He actually named her Rose! Neville's face resembled an extremely ripe tomato. He attempted an apologetic look, but it turned out looking more like a grimace. Hermione leaned back in her chair and tried to keep her breathing under control. She had a sudden urge to break something. Of all the names Ron could have chosen for his daughter, he had to choose the one they'd picked together. He may as well have punched her in the face. Hermione, said Neville cautiously. You okay? I'm great. So great. Never been better. Are you sure about that? Asked Veronica. Because you look like you're ready to kill somebody. At that, Hermione snapped. She stood abruptly, opened her mouth, then closed it, deciding it was far too risky to attempt to speak in her current mood. So instead, she turned right around and stormed out of the great hall, wishing for the first time in 2 years that she could see Ron Weasley again, because she wanted to crack open his skull.